It was late autumn in 2004, in the heart of a quiet American town that had long since faded from any map of urgency. Perhaps somewhere in western Pennsylvania, where old brick homes leaned into each other like aging veterans, and the trees in the city park dropped their yellowing leaves like confessions of another year survived. The wind carried the smell of wet soil and rusted iron benches, and the light filtered through the thinning canopy in gold-tinted strips, casting long shadows on the cobblestone path that wound through the park like an old memory trying to find its way home. Every afternoon, almost to the minute, a hunched old man appeared, pushing a squeaky metal cart filled with empty soda bottles, beer cans, and the occasional crumpled newspaper that someone had tossed aside, his progress slow but steady, like a ritual carried out not for survival, but for something deeper, older, and unspoken. His name, as far as anyone knew, was simply Joe, a common name for an uncommon silence. No one really knew where he lived, and he never spoke unless spoken to first. To most, he was a fixture of the neighborhood, a man-shaped shadow who moved from one recycling bin to the next without making eye contact, without asking for anything, and without expecting to be noticed. The local children whispered about him with the kind of casual fear that only comes from ignorance. Teenagers, bold in the safety of their own youth, mocked his cart and muttered jokes as he passed. Adults avoided him out of polite indifference, nodding when necessary, but never asking his name, never wondering about the life that led him here. But Margaret Hayes, a retired history teacher with a keen eye for stories hidden in plain sight, saw something else, not in his ragged coat or calloused hands, but in the way he moved, as though carrying not bottles and cans, but years, memories, and perhaps even guilt. On a grey Thursday afternoon, as she sat on her usual bench beneath a fading oak tree, sipping lukewarm tea from a chipped thermos and making notes for the memoir she never told anyone she was writing, she watched Joe pass by, just as he had the day before, and the day before that. But that day, something changed. As he adjusted his coat, a small object slipped silently from his pocket and landed near her feet, a worn brown leather wallet with corners curled from age and use. She bent down, picked it up, and turned to return it, calling out gently, "Sir, I think you dropped this." Joe paused mid-step, turned without urgency, and shuffled back toward her. She held the wallet out to him, but as he reached for it, something fell loose from one of its creased folds. A photograph, black and white, its edges softened with time. Margaret caught it before the wind could carry it away. What she saw stopped her heart for a beat. The photo showed a young man in uniform, an airman, standing straight, cap tilted at just the right angle, with a half-smile that belonged more to the past than the present. The insignia on his jacket was unmistakable, the United States Army Air Forces, circa World War II. But it wasn't the uniform that struck her, it was the eyes. Eyes that, even in a decades-old photo, burned with intensity, hope, and something else, something broken. She looked up at Joe. For the first time, he met her gaze. His expression didn't change, but something flickered, recognition perhaps, or fear, or the dawning realization that a secret long buried had just stirred again. Is this you?" she asked quietly, holding out the photo like an offering. He didn't answer. Instead, he took the wallet, pocketed the picture without a word, and turned back down the path. But his pace had changed, slower, almost cautious, as though the ground beneath his feet had shifted in some invisible way. Margaret remained on the bench long after he had disappeared from view, the sound of his cart's wheels echoing faintly behind him, and she knew, without question, that what she had seen was more than a forgotten picture from a long-lost war. It was the beginning of a story that no one had dared ask him to tell, not until now. If this story is already touching you the way it touched me while writing it, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. That small act helps us keep telling real stories that move, inspire, and reveal. And now, prepare yourself. What comes next will change everything. The next morning, long before the usual hum of the neighborhood began, before the cafes filled with murmurs, before joggers passed through the park with their earbuds and destination-driven strides, Margaret Hayes was already seated on her bench, wrapped in her wool coat, her hands clasped around a mug of coffee that had grown cold before the sun ever had a chance to rise. She wasn't entirely sure what had brought her back so early. Perhaps it was curiosity or concern, or that unmistakable tug of something unfinished, something waiting beneath the surface of routine. What she did know was that the moment she saw that photograph, the young man in the military uniform, with eyes that didn't belong to strangers, something had shifted in her. Something old and unnamed that now demanded attention. Joe came at his usual time, just past 9, the same hunched figure, the same slow gait, the same cart creaking at his side like an old companion with a limp. But this time, he paused when he saw her, just slightly, just enough to make it clear that he remembered. She raised her hand in greeting, not expecting him to wave back, but he gave the briefest of nods, as though acknowledging that something had passed between them the day before that couldn't be undone. "Would you sit with me?" she asked gently, standing to clear space beside her on the bench. "Just for a few minutes, no questions unless you want them." Joe looked at the spot, looked at her, and then, after a moment of thought, lowered himself slowly onto the bench with the weight of someone who had spent most of his life standing outside the circle of things. He didn't speak, and neither did she at first. The silence between them was not awkward, but dense, rich even, with the presence of something forming slowly, like steam rising off cooling asphalt. "I'm sorry if I pushed yesterday," Margaret said, keeping her voice low and her gaze forward. "I didn't mean to pry, it's just that photo. My father served too, Army Infantry, Normandy. He never talked about it either." For a long moment, Joe said nothing. Then, in a voice so rough it seemed to scrape its way out of his throat, he muttered, "Most of us didn't." Margaret turned slightly toward him, surprised not by the answer itself, but by the sound of it, the unmistakable timbre of someone who hadn't used his voice for storytelling in years. She didn't press further, just nodded slowly, letting the moment breathe. A squirrel darted past. Somewhere down the path, a child laughed. Life went on, oblivious to the sacred stillness on the bench. "I was 20, Joe said suddenly, not looking at her. "Joined the Army Air Forces in 43, trained in Georgia, flew recon over northern France." The words came slowly, unevenly, like stones pulled from a deep well, one by one, heavy with age and meaning. Margaret listened without interrupting, feeling each sentence settle between them like bricks being laid for a structure neither of them could quite see yet. "We used to believe we were coming home," he continued, "that we'd fight our war, come back, get married, get jobs, live, simple. But war doesn't end when the guns stop, not for some of us." He told her, haltingly but clearly, about the mission that changed everything. June 1944, a low-altitude recon run over St. Lo, just weeks after D-Day. Flak tore through their right wing, smoke, fire, alarms. He bailed out too low, broke his leg on landing, was taken by German forces within an hour. Spent the rest of the war in a POW camp near Hammelburg. The liberation came in April 45, but by then the war had carved itself so deep into his bones that even the gates of freedom felt more like the entrance to a different kind of prison. "I came back," he said, finally looking her in the eyes, "but not to what I left behind. My parents had passed. My girl, she'd married someone else. Letters never reached me. I never reached her." Margaret's breath caught slightly, but she didn't speak. Her heart ached, not just for the loss, but for the quiet dignity with which he carried it. Not as bitterness, not as anger, but as fact, as truth. He continued, about the years that followed, drifting from job to job, state to state, working as a mechanic, a janitor, a watchman. No family, no real friends, just years marked by the sound of footsteps and the weight of memories. At some point, he stopped talking about himself in the first person. "The vet moves around," he said once. "The vet doesn't stay too long." As if he had become his own ghost, narrating his life from a distance. Margaret wanted to cry, but she knew it would break the fragile trust forming between them, so instead she simply reached into her bag and handed him a folded napkin with a warm sandwich she'd packed just in case. He took it, almost surprised, then nodded once, deeper than before. As the sun reached its zenith and the world grew a little brighter, Joe stood slowly, as though each bone had to ask permission from the next. Before he walked away, he looked down at her and said, "Her name was Lillian, my girl. I don't know if she ever had a daughter." Then he left, and Margaret sat very still, her mind racing, not with judgment, not with shock, but with something else. A question she hadn't asked, but knew she soon would. It was a few days after their quiet exchange on the bench, and although Joe hadn't spoken of the photo again, something had shifted, a softening in his manner, a willingness to linger just a few moments longer when passing Margaret's bench. And in those moments, she began to see not just an old man weathered by time, but someone carrying a past so heavy that it had shaped his posture, his silence, even the slow rhythm of his breath. One morning, without prompting, he arrived carrying an old thermos and 2 chipped enamel cups. He poured them both coffee and sat beside her without a word, and in that unspoken offering she understood. He was ready to tell her the part of the story that had never found a home. "I used to love the sky," he began, staring ahead as if trying to locate something no longer visible to the naked eye. "When you're up there, above the clouds, you don't think about politics or pain or the face of the man in the gunner seat next to you. You just think about staying alive, about doing your job, and about coming back in one piece." Ew. He told her that he'd enlisted in the spring of 1943, barely 19, swept up in the fever of the time, fueled by the speeches on the radio, the posters on every telephone pole, and the promise that this war would be the one to end them all. "We were boys with sharp salutes and no idea what we were marching into," he said. After basic training in Texas and technical school in Florida, he was assigned to a reconnaissance unit. His job was to fly low and fast over enemy territory and bring back photographs the generals would pore over in rooms lit by maps and ashtrays. He became part of the 8th Air Force, stationed first in England, then in France, as the Allied front advanced. At first, the missions felt like adrenaline. The cockpit smelled of leather, sweat, and fuel. The roar of the engines vibrated in his ribs like a second heartbeat. The flak fire below them was distant, like fireworks, until it wasn't. Until it punched through metal and flesh alike. "You think you're immortal until the guy next to you isn't," Joe said quietly, and Margaret didn't need to ask more. The look in his eyes was enough. It was during a rare leave in southern England, between assignments, that he met her, Lillian, in a crowded dance hall lit with strings of bulbs that flickered like hopes that might or might not last. She was 22, worked in a munitions factory by day, danced like she remembered what joy was by night. He was quiet, unsure, still half boy, but she kissed him first. They talked until dawn on a bench, not unlike the one where he now sat with Margaret. "I told her I'd come back," he said. "I told her we'd go to Chicago, maybe open a diner. I told her 100 things. But the war, as it does, had other plans." On June 14th, 1944, while returning from a mission over the French countryside, his aircraft was hit. A direct strike that blew out the right wing and sent them spinning into a controlled crash just outside a rural village. He survived, pulled from the wreckage by French civilians, hidden in a barn for 2 days before being discovered by German patrols. He was taken to Stalag 13 a prisoner of war camp in Bavaria, where the air was thick with despair and the days bled together like pages of a diary never meant to be read. "I lost time in there," Joe said. "Not just days or months, but who I was before. I forgot the sound of her voice. I forgot my own laugh. I forgot what it felt like to belong to someone." When the camp was liberated in April 1945, Joe was nothing more than a frame of himself, 30 pounds underweight, eyes hollow, the war carved into the lines of his face. He returned to the United States expecting something that no longer existed. His parents had passed during his captivity. His childhood home was sold, and when he tracked down Lillian's address in a small Ohio town, he found a mailbox with a different name and a neighbor who told him with kind eyes and quiet lips that she had married in '44. After word came, he was presumed dead. "I stood on the sidewalk for a long time," he said. "Then I walked away." What followed were years of motion without destination. Jobs came and went. Cities passed through him like rain through an open window. He avoided VA hospitals. He avoided old friends. "I wasn't looking for anything anymore," he said, "just keeping the wheels turning." Margaret sat still, the air around them holding its breath, and all she could think about was how many men like him had passed through American streets, unrecognized, unseen, stories folded up like old maps, never opened, never followed. And as Joe sipped the last of his coffee, he looked at her and said, "I carried that photo all these years, not because I thought I'd see her again, but because it was proof I'd mattered to someone, once." And Margaret, blinking away tears that surprised even her, simply placed her hand over his and whispered, "You still do." Margaret had always believed there were silences in her family that meant nothing. Those long pauses in conversations with her mother, the unanswered questions about her childhood, the missing photographs from certain years. But now, in the quiet of her home, with Joe's story echoing through her thoughts like footsteps down a familiar but unexplored hallway, those silences began to feel internal, not malicious perhaps, but protective, constructed, built to shield a truth too fragile to withstand daylight, until someone cared enough to open the window. That evening, Margaret went to the old cedar chest in her attic, the one she hadn't opened in years, the one that still smelled faintly of dust and time. Inside were boxes of memories, report cards, her father's worn dog tags from his own military service, Christmas cards never sent, and, buried beneath a stack of yellowed newspaper clippings, a bundle of letters tied together with a faded blue ribbon. The moment she saw the handwriting on the top envelope, her breath caught. She had seen that script before, in the way her mother signed notes on the fridge, in birthday cards, in recipe books. But this handwriting wasn't addressed to her father. It was addressed to a name she didn't recognize, to Joseph. She untied the ribbon slowly, reverently, and began to read. "Dearest Joe," the first letter began, dated July 12, 1944. "I don't know if this will ever find you. Word came that your plane went down. They said you were lost, presumed dead, but I don't believe that. I can't." The letter was from Lillian, the same Lillian Joe had spoken of, and as Margaret read, the words took shape, not as romantic flourishes, but as a young woman's aching truth. That she had carried his child, a daughter born the following spring, and that her family, fearing shame and scandal, had insisted she marry another man, someone stable, someone present, someone whose name would appear on the birth certificate. "I named her Margaret," the letter said, "because I thought it sounded strong, like the kind of woman she might need to be." By the time Margaret finished the third letter, her hands were trembling. She wasn't the daughter of the man she had called father. She was the child of Lillian and Joe, of a love interrupted by war, buried beneath years of silence, and only now resurfacing through time's fragile stitching. At first, she didn't know what to do. How do you tell someone they've been a father all along and never knew it? How do you tell yourself that the story you thought was yours was only part of the truth? She didn't sleep that night. Instead, she sat at her kitchen table, reading and rereading the letters, tracing the curves of her mother's handwriting like a map back to something sacred. She remembered how Lillian had never spoken much about her past, how she'd sometimes look out the window with a faraway expression when war movies played on television. Margaret had always assumed it was about her own father's service. She hadn't known it was about someone else entirely, someone she'd just met on a park bench. The next morning, she walked to the park, not as a neighbor, not as a stranger, but as a daughter. Joe was already there, sitting on the bench where everything had begun. He looked up when he saw her, and something in his face shifted. Not surprise, not fear, but a quiet readiness. as if he knew she was carrying something heavy, as if he was in some way expecting it. She sat beside him, took a deep breath and said, "My mother's name was Lillian." He didn't react at first, but she saw his knuckles tighten slightly around the edge of the bench. "She passed away 6 years ago," Margaret continued. "She never talked much about before the war, but I found her letters to you." Joe turned slowly to face her, his eyes suddenly sharp and searching, as if trying to read the truth on her face. "She wrote that she had a daughter," Margaret said, her voice trembling, "that she named her Margaret, because she didn't know if you'd ever come back, but she wanted your memory to live in some way." The silence that followed was vast, like the open sky he once flew through, and just as full of danger, beauty, and the unknown. Joe blinked hard, once, then again, and when he finally spoke, his voice was unsteady in a way that broke something open in both of them. "I never knew," he whispered. "She never told me." "She couldn't," Margaret said. "She wanted to. I think she always hoped. But life, it took that choice from her." Joe looked down at his hands, gnarled and worn, as if seeing them for the first time. And then, in a moment so quiet it felt sacred, he reached out and placed his hand gently over hers. "I have a daughter," he said. "I had a daughter. I have you." The words fell from him like water from a stone, like something locked up so long it had forgotten what light felt like. And Margaret, not a child anymore, not just a curious woman with questions, leaned into the warmth of that touch and let herself feel the truth, not in her head, but in her chest, where stories become blood and breath. They sat that way for a long time, not speaking, just breathing, because some things don't need to be said, they only need to be known. In the days that followed the quiet but seismic revelation between Margaret and Joe, a new kind of silence settled between them. Not the silence of avoidance or discomfort, but the tender, reverent hush that falls when two people find themselves suddenly standing in the middle of something sacred and fragile, like the middle of a cathedral built from memory. Neither rushed to define what had happened, nor did they try to shape it into something easy or palatable. Instead, they returned each day to the same bench beneath the old elm, sharing coffee, a bag of breakfast rolls, and the strange, miraculous weight of a truth that had waited more than half a century to be spoken aloud. Joe no longer pushed his cart through the park every morning. In fact, he rarely brought it at all. Instead, Margaret would walk beside him, slowly, carefully, as if time itself had softened its grip, guiding him towards something that neither of them had ever imagined possible, a second beginning. She took him to the diner near the library, where the waitress learned his name and how he liked his eggs. She sat with him on her porch while the sun set and the neighborhood kids rode their bikes through the golden light of evening. And one Sunday, she invited him home, her home. She had prepared pot roast, her mother's old recipe, the one Lillian used to make on the rare weekends when the air felt cool and the world felt safe. The dining room table, once set only for one, now had an extra chair. Her son, David, came by that afternoon with his 2 children, curious, polite, wide-eyed at the idea of a man their grandmother had only recently discovered was, in fact, their great-grandfather. Joe sat at the table quietly at first, his posture stiff, unsure, as though waiting for someone to tell him he didn't belong. But when little Ellie, the younger of the 2, climbed onto his lap with a drawing she had made just for him, a picture of him and Margaret under a big tree with the word family written across the top in shaky block letters, something broke gently inside him. Not a wound, but a dam. He wept, not loudly, not shamefully, but openly. Tears ran silently down his cheeks as he held the drawing to his chest, and in that moment no one said a word, because they didn't have to. Some moments don't need explanation, they only need witnesses. In the weeks that followed, Margaret worked with a local Veterans Service office to track down Joe's military records. With the help of a patient caseworker and a dusty file tucked away in the National Archives, they confirmed his enlistment, his deployment, his survival as a POW. They found the documents, They found the medals that had never been delivered. And one crisp October morning, in a small ceremony at City Hall, attended by a handful of family, city staff, and 2 local high school students writing a report on forgotten veterans, Joe was finally recognized, officially, publicly, and irreversibly. The mayor, in a modest suit and with genuine words, placed the long overdue ribbon in Joe's hands and said, "Sergeant Joseph E. Langford, on behalf of the United States of America, we thank you for your service." Joe said nothing. He didn't need to. The weight of the medal in his palm said everything. After the ceremony, as they stepped back into the sunlight, Margaret took his arm. "You were never invisible," she said. "You were just waiting to be seen again." He smiled at her, a real smile, one that crinkled his eyes and softened his face, and replied, "I didn't think I'd ever be part of something again." "You're part of us," she said. "You always were." Joe moved into a small, assisted living apartment not far from Margaret's house. He decorated it sparsely. A few books, a photo of Lillian from their brief summer in England, and prominently displayed on a shelf near the window, the medal he had received. But more than that, the room filled slowly with new photographs. Margaret and him in the park, Ellie on his lap at Thanksgiving, David helping him with a new pair of hearing aids, a 4th of July barbecue with sparklers reflected in the lens of his thick-rimmed glasses. A life once paused, now resuming. He began writing. Short letters mostly, to veterans he'd served with, to strangers, to himself. Margaret helped him craft a small essay, which they submitted to the local paper. It was titled, "Things We Don't Say Out Loud." It ran on Veterans Day. The response was overwhelming. High school students visited him to hear his story. A documentary student asked for an interview. Neighbors dropped off meals. One man left a folded American flag and a note that read, "Thank you for surviving what most of us never understood." In the quiet of his room one evening, as he watched the shadows stretch across the floor and the first stars blink awake in the darkening sky, Joe said to Margaret, "I used to think I died in that camp, that the rest was just leftover breath. But now it feels like I finally came home." Joe passed quietly on a Sunday morning in early spring, just as the light was beginning to stretch its golden fingers across the city rooftops, and the cherry blossoms outside his window swayed gently in the breeze, like old friends waving farewell. There was no struggle, no alarm, only the soft exhale of a man who had, after so many years of exile from his own story, finally returned to it. He died with his hands resting over a folded letter, the last one Lillian had ever written, and beside him on the nightstand stood a small photo of Margaret, holding his hand at the veterans' ceremony, both of them smiling as if they knew something the world had forgotten, that time may take much, but it cannot erase what is rediscovered through love. When Margaret arrived at his room, called by the gentle urgency of a nurse who had come to care for him that morning, she didn't cry immediately. She simply sat beside his bed, took his weathered hand into hers one last time, and whispered the same words she had said when he first learned the truth. "You were never lost. You were just waiting to be found." And in that room, full of light and memory, the silence that followed was not emptiness, it was peace. Joe's funeral was modest, as he would have preferred. No lavish eulogies, no grand processions, but the people who came were many. Neighbors who once walked past him in silence now stood with hands over hearts. Children who had once watched him from a distance now left small notes and drawings by his grave. Veterans, old and young, came with medals on their jackets and tears in their eyes, grateful not just for his service, but for the story that had reminded them all of what so many had endured in silence. Margaret gave the only speech, standing beside a framed photograph of the young airman from so long ago and a folded flag resting gently on the casket. Her voice was steady, not because she wasn't grieving, but because she was standing in the light of something larger than loss. "Joe Langford lived a quiet life," she said, "but it was not an empty one. It was a life filled with memory, with sorrow, with courage, and finally with love. He was my grandfather. I didn't grow up knowing him, but I will carry him with me for the rest of my days." Later, the city placed a small plaque on the park bench where Margaret and Joe first met. The same bench where the old wallet had fallen, the same bench where history reached forward and found its missing piece. It read simply, "Here sat Joe Langford, a forgotten hero found by the love of family." Margaret published a small book that summer, a collection of memories, letters, and reflections called The Silent Flight of Joe Langford. It wasn't a bestseller, but it didn't need to be. It was read by those who needed to hear it. Sons without fathers, daughters with questions, families searching for missing pieces in the attic boxes of their own lives. And sometimes, on quiet evenings, Margaret would walk with her grandchildren to that same bench, sit beneath the shade of the now blooming tree, and read aloud from Joe's letters, so that his story, once nearly erased by war and time, would live on in the voice of a generation that refused to forget. We share new videos every day, true stories that move, inspire, and stay with you. If this story touched you like it touched me while writing it, give it a like and subscribe. It helps us keep bringing real stories to life.